The Value of Conviction, the story of Cesar Chavez. This story is based on the life of Cesar Chavez, the man who founded the National Farm Workers Association. Cesar Chavez had very strong convictions. Conviction is a strong belief or opinion that influences a person's choices, actions, and behaviors. He maintained his convictions throughout his life and helped many people because of them. During the Great Depression, there was a terrible drought. Without water, many farmers could not grow crops. And without crops, they could not pay their bills. When the Chavezes could not make their payments, the bank took away their farm. The Chavezes packed up their car and went on the road. Like many poor families, the Chavezes traveled from one farm to another. They picked vegetables like peas, lettuce, and fruit, whichever crops were ripe, such as tomatoes. They were migrant farm laborers. Cesar and his family lived in camps set up by the growers who owned the big farms. The broken-down shacks were crowded together. They were not like the beautiful farmhouse his family had lost.
Where's the sink?
Cesar wondered.
Where is the bathroom?
Caesar's mother shook her head.
There is no running water.
We will not always live like this.
Mr. Chavez promised. Cesar didn't like to see his parents sad, so he never complained. Cesar tried to help as much as he could. He collected old tinfoil and sold it to the junk man to buy a used sweatshirt. He gathered wild mustard greens to help feed the family. Cesar and his brothers and sisters often helped their parents in the fields too. But sometimes they went to school. Because the family moved all the time, Cesar went to 30 different elementary schools. As you can imagine, he barely learned to read and write. Cesar heard other students reading. He wanted to read too. But by the time he started learning, it was always time to move again. One day Cesar recited the Pledge of Allegiance with the other students. The last line echoed in his mind.
With liberty and justice for all.
Cesar liked that idea. Justice for all meant that every person in the country had a fair chance to lead a good life. That kind of belief made America a special country. But it is not enough just to believe good things. A person or a country must live according to its beliefs or convictions. Cesar gazed around the classroom. Most children had clean clothes and new shoes. Cesar had no shoes at all. Things did not seem fair to Cesar. Cesar felt angry. When he was alone, he shouted,
This isn't fair.
No, it isn't.
Replied a voice from above.
But sometimes people can change things.
For a moment, Cesar thought he was hearing things. Then he saw an eagle perched on a branch over his head. Cesar asked,
Who are you?
You may call me Hugo.
The eagle replied proudly. Cesar smiled.
You are a strong bird, but I am just a boy. What can I do to change things?
I am strong.
Hugo agreed.
But so are the little starlings that block the sun.
Cesar saw the huge flock of starlings. Together, the flock was able to block out the light from the sun.
You see?
Hugo replied.
Because all the little starlings fly together, their wings are even bigger than mine. You can lead a flock someday.
And with that, the mighty eagle flew away. Cesar knew that Hugo was not a talking eagle, and he did not understand how leading a flock could change things. But Cesar liked to talk to his imaginary friend. One day Cesar and Hugo waited together for Mr. Chavez to be paid. The grower's foreman did not pay Cesar's father as much as he had promised. But Mr. Chavez took the money anyway. Arguing with the foreman would only get him fired.
The rest of the laborers were cheated, too. It isn't fair.
Cesar replied to Hugo with conviction.
The law should protect the farm worker.
By working together, the farm laborers can change the law.
Hugo cried as she flew away. One morning, Mr. Chavez stopped at a coffee shop on his way to work. The woman behind the counter wouldn't serve him. Instead, she replied,
We don't want Mexicans here. Get out!
Caesar's cheeks burned with shame. He knew his father was a good, honest man and a hard worker. But the woman wouldn't serve him just because he was poor and Mexican. Caesar thought about the Pledge of Allegiance.
Liberty and justice for all should mean all people.
He replied to Hugo. Hugo understood what Caesar meant and appreciated his conviction.
No matter how poor people are or where they come from.
Hugo agreed.
Someday you will have a chance to stand up for your beliefs.
Later in the fields, Caesar heard a man talking with deep conviction. He was an organization organizer.
Justice is all we're asking for.
He told the laborers.
If we all band together, we can make the growers give us fair wages.
The crowd cheered.
Strike! Wilka! Strike!
To strike, laborers refused to work and formed picket lines to protest unfair pay or bad working conditions. Huelga is the Spanish word for strike.
When we win this strike, we will be protected by the law, just like other laborers.
Mr. Chavez proudly told his son. Unfortunately, it did not. Caesar's father joined many other organizations and walked on other picket lines. But each strike was crushed by the powerful growers.
It's hopeless.
Caesar replied to Hugo.
The growers are much stronger than we are.
It is difficult,
Hugo agreed.
but things are never hopeless. You must have the courage to stand by your convictions. Your cause is just. And remember, I will always be here to help you.
Caesar always felt better after talking to Hugo, and his friend helped him through some tough times. When he was in the Navy during World War II, most of the other sailors wouldn't talk to Caesar because he was Mexican.
It's so unfair.
Caesar told Hugo.
I work and fight just as hard as they do.
Hugo shook his head.
No, it isn't right. But someday we can work together to change things.
After the Navy, Caesar returned to being a migrant farm worker. He joined an organization and went on strike. But, as always, the strike failed. Caesar burned with rage at the injustice.
The growers earn so much money from the work we do. Why can't they pay us just a little more? Then we could earn a decent living.
Hugo spread her large wings over Caesar's shoulders.
Someday, my friend, you will lead a flock of laborers so big you will overcome even the strongest growers.
One day, when he was working in Delano, California, Caesar met a young woman who shared his convictions. Her name was Helen, and she was also a farm worker. Caesar and Helen fell in love and soon were married. Caesar was very happy, especially when their first baby was born. But he couldn't help thinking about the baby's future.
Will he learn to read and write?
Caesar wondered.
Will he have to start working before he's finished growing? Will he grow up in a world ruled by justice, or by rich, powerful people who profit by cheating the poor?
Hugo whispered.
That's up to you.
Caesar and Helen worked very hard just to feed their growing family. Then one day, a man named Fred Ross came to see Caesar. Fred worked for a group called the Community Service Organization, CSO. He wanted Caesar to help him teach the poor people of Delano to help themselves. Caesar did not want to meet with Fred. Often people from the government or charity groups came in and asked a lot of questions. They took a lot of notes. Then they went away, and nothing changed. But Fred Ross did not go away. Finally, Caesar agreed to meet him. Fred arrived in a rusty car. He spoke Spanish. Best of all, Fred understood how hopeless farm laborers felt. And he had ideas about how the laborers could make things better for themselves and their children. Caesar was very impressed with Fred, and Fred was very impressed with Caesar. Fred could tell right away that this small, quiet man had deep convictions. Someday he might even become a great leader. Caesar's friends agreed to listen, but Fred was the one who did most of the listening. Caesar watched as the organizer pulled each person into the discussion. Soon, they were all talking like old friends. And these friends were united in a purpose, helping the farm laborers gain the power to make their own lives better. After the meeting, Caesar replied to Fred.
What do we do next?
Fred smiled.
I've got another meeting. I don't suppose you'd like to come.
Caesar jumped into Fred's rusty old car. From then on, Caesar was the organizer's constant companion. Fred showed Caesar how to turn his convictions into practical actions to advance his cause. Caesar felt as if he had suddenly sprouted wings like Hugo's. At last, he was learning to fly. Caesar became a CSO volunteer. His first job was to get other Mexican Americans to register to vote. Caesar asked his friends to help too. They went door to door telling people,
If we all vote, we can make a difference.
Caesar was glad to have a purpose. Now he was doing his part to make things better. Fred noticed how hard Caesar worked. He made Caesar leader of all the volunteers. In a few months, Caesar was hired by the CSO. At first, Caesar felt shy about leading meetings. But his old friend Hugo replied,
Never be afraid to act on your convictions. Just do your best.
So, Caesar did his best. Soon he was leading all the chapters in the San Joaquin Valley and opening new chapters in many other towns. When he was only 31 years old, Caesar was named General Director of the Community Service Organization. The CSO became very successful. The group gave their organizers raises and bought fancy company cars. But it didn't seem right to Caesar.
Should I accept the raise? It would make life much easier for me and my family.
Caesar reasoned. Hugo agreed.
But it wouldn't make life easier for the people you are trying to help.
Caesar knew Hugo was right. He also knew that having convictions sometimes meant sacrificing your own comfort to a cause. Caesar was used to doing without luxuries, but he did not think he could live without his convictions. Caesar didn't accept the raise or the car. He replied the CSO should build a farm laborers organization instead.
The farm laborers will never form a successful organization.
The CSO leaders replied.
We have to try.
Caesar pleaded. But the leaders refused. Caesar took out all the money in his bank account. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He met with his brother Richard and his cousin Manuel and, of course, Helen, and he replied,
Please help me start a farm laborers organization.
Richard and Manuel both had good jobs.
We aren't farm laborers.
They replied.
Why should we join your organization?
Caesar replied.
Because we can't turn our backs on our beliefs.
Richard and Manuel agreed to help. Helen felt very proud. Caesar's flock was small, but it would grow. Caesar spent the next 6 months handing out cards to the laborers in the fields. On the cards were questions. How much money do you think you should be paid? Are you treated fairly? Caesar listened to what the laborers had to say. He handed out 80,000 cards. Sometimes a worker wrote a note on the back, just to say he thought Caesar was doing a good thing. Caesar visited each person who wrote a note. Many of them joined his new organization. Since no one was paying Caesar to build an organization, he had to work other jobs too. On Sundays he dug ditches. Helen picked grapes. But after a year, all of their savings were gone. Caesar didn't know what to do. He couldn't give up on the organization, nor could he let his children starve. What do you think he did?
Ask the people for help.
Hugo advised. Caesar declared.
I will not beg.
Your cause is more important than your pride.
Hugo replied.
Besides, if you want to help people, you must let them help you.
So, Caesar asked the poor farm laborers for food for his family. The laborers were moved by Caesar's convictions. Here was a man who was willing to give up everything, even the well-being of his own family, to act on his beliefs. They gave Caesar what little they had, and they joined his organization. One night, when all the organization members were gathered, Manuel presented the organization flag he had made. When Caesar saw it, he couldn't help but wonder if his imaginary friend Hugo had somehow visited his cousin, too. The flag showed a proud eagle drawn in the style of the Aztec Indians of Mexico. Some of the members didn't like it, but Caesar replied,
To me, it looks like a strong, beautiful sign of hope.
Manuel jumped up and shouted,
When that eagle flies, the problems of the farm laborers will be solved.
Solving problems is not easy to do. Building an organization was a long, slow journey. A lot of members got tired and lost faith. Even Caesar felt discouraged sometimes. Once, he was offered a high-paying job with the Peace Corps in South America. Again, he had the chance to make his life easier.
What should I do?
He asked Hugo. The eagle replied,
Follow your heart.
Caesar straightened his shoulders. The light came back into his gentle brown eyes. He would follow the path of his convictions. I will get justice for the farm laborers of America.
Caesar kept struggling to build his organization. One day a worker named Manuel Rivera came to see Caesar. Mr. Rivera was cheated out of his pay, and his car had broken down, too. Without a car, he could not pick up his family at the bus station, and they had been waiting there for 3 days. Caesar picked up Mr. Rivera's family and let them stay at his own home. He helped Mr. Rivera get his wages. Mr. Rivera asked Caesar,
What do I owe you?
Caesar replied,
You owe me nothing. Only help the other farm laborers.
Mr. Rivera told other laborers how kind Caesar had been. Soon Mr. Rivera had brought in 100 new organization members. That is just one example of how Caesar's organization grew. By the mid-1960s, the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, included more than 1,700 families. The new organization had won to pay raises from Delano Vineyards. But their biggest fight was yet to come. In September of 1965, 800 Filipino grape pickers went on strike. The members of Caesar's NFWA voted to join them. Caesar was afraid his young organization was not ready to go on strike.
What if losing pay makes the people scared for their families? What if they quit before the strike succeeds? The growers are so powerful.
Caesar fretted. Hugo flew over the picket line.
Remember the starling birds.
The eagle whispered,
Remember you are not alone. Together we are strong.
Caesar knew he had to do something to keep the organization members eating during the strike. He asked church leaders for help. He asked for support from other organizations and from magazines and important politicians such as Senator Robert Kennedy. Caesar also went to colleges to raise money and tell the students about the plight of farm laborers in America. During one speech, students booed and threw eggs and tomatoes at him. Caesar was so tired, he barely noticed. He just kept talking in his soft, earnest voice, and then students started listening. Finally, the booing turned to applause. They were clapping for Caesar. The NFWA gained many new young friends that day. The growers did everything they could to break the strike. They tried to scare the laborers off the picket lines by threatening them with guns. They tried to kick and punch the picketers. What do you think would have happened if a picketer had kicked back? Caesar knew they would all be arrested. He also knew the only way the organization could win was by rising above the violence used by the growers. Caesar believed in not fighting, so he did his best to calm down the picketers. The strike drew the attention of many people, including members of the U.S. government. Caesar was asked to address a Senate subcommittee on migrant labor. Caesar was afraid to speak in front of so many important people, but Hugo replied,
Just tell the truth, as you always do.
So, Caesar replied,
All we need is the recognition of our right to full and equal coverage under every law that protects every working man and woman in this country. What we demand is very simple. We want equality.
The senators were very impressed, but Caesar knew that changing laws takes a long time. So, he decided to do something else to draw attention to the cause. On March 17, 1966, Caesar and 65 grape pickers began a march from Delano to Sacramento, the capital of California 300 miles away. Along the way, many people listened to what Caesar and the laborers had to say. They gave the marchers food and offered them shelter in their homes. Many joined the march. By the time they reached Sacramento, there were 10,000 marchers. Hugo flew near Caesar's ear and crowed,
Look how big your flock is now!
The march brought a lot of attention to Caesar's cause. Many growers soon agreed to sign organization contracts that gave the laborers higher wages and other benefits, including the right to fair negotiations and the right to strike without being arrested or harassed. Still, some growers refused to talk to the Farm Laborers Organization. So, in January of 1968, Caesar started a boycott of all grapes grown by non-organization growers. A boycott means people refuse to buy something as a protest. In this case, people all over the country stopped buying certain brands of California grapes to support the farm laborers. Caesar hoped those growers would lose money from the boycott and be forced to negotiate with the organization. The growers laughed at the boycott. They just sold their grapes under different brand names. This discouraged the organization members. They had been on strike for a long time, but victory seemed as far away as ever. The growers used violence. Why can't we? Some of the organization members demanded. Caesar was determined not to use violence. In fact, he was so determined to win through nonviolence that he refused to eat for 25 days. He knew this hunger strike would attract attention to his cause, and it would show how important nonviolence was to him when they saw how thin and weak he had become. The members worried about Caesar's health. They also saw how nonviolence was more important to Caesar than anything, even his own life. Violence wasn't the only tough issue facing the organization. Some of the Mexican laborers didn't want to share their organization with Filipino laborers. Caesar was sad because of this. All his life he had experienced injustice of prejudice. And now members of his own organization wanted him to discriminate against others. He asked Hugo,
What should I do?
The eagle's bright eyes flashed.
Do what you always do. Stand up for your convictions?
Caesar told the Mexican laborers that if they did not want the Filipinos in the organization, they did not want him either. The laborers did not want Caesar to leave and stop the demands. A few months later, Caesar asked the same Mexican laborers if they still wanted to get rid of the Filipinos. The laborers replied, "Why would we want to do that?" Caesar laughed. Years had passed, and still the strike dragged on. Sometimes Caesar wondered if it would ever end. Then he got an idea. Instead of just boycotting some brands of grapes in the United States, the organization asked people all over the world to stop buying all California grapes. Soon thousands of pounds of grapes were being left to rot in the fields. People everywhere had stopped buying grapes. Finally, the grape growers realized they would lose more money trying to hold out against the organization than they would by meeting the organization's demands. On July 29, 1970, 26 major Delano grape growers signed contracts with the Farm Laborers Organization. Cesar Chavez finally tasted victory at last, and it was sweeter than the finest grapes.
You see, Caesar,
Laughed Hugo.
your flock became strong enough to overcome even the strongest of growers.
But the next day Hugo called to him.
Goodbye, Caesar.
He asked,
Where are you going?
There are other battles to be won.
Hugo explained.
Other laborers, like the lettuce pickers, still don't have fair wages or an organization to protect them.
Caesar thought for a moment. He had just won a very hard battle. He deserved a rest. But how could he rest when there was still so much injustice in the world? What do you think Caesar did? He called after his friend and replied,
Hugo, wait for me.